Okay, Managing for Stakeholders, R. Edward Freeman. Introduction. The purpose of this essay is to outline an emerging view of business that we shall call managing for stakeholders. This view has emerged over the past 30 years from a group of scholars in a diverse set of disciplines, from finance to philosophy. The basic idea is that businesses and the executives who manage them actually do and should create value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and financiers or shareholders. And that we need to pay careful attention to how these relationships are managed and how value gets created for these stakeholders. We contrast this idea with the dominant model of business activity, namely that businesses are to be managed solely for the benefit of shareholders. Any other benefits or harms that are created are incidental. Okay, so we have two alternative models. One model defended by Freeman in this article is the stakeholder model, or managing for stakeholders. So according to that model, we have these different groups: customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and shareholders, and also some other secondary groups, but we'll mainly focus on these. And according to this model, executives should create value for all of these groups, all of these stakeholders. The alternative model is the one that was defended by Freeman in The Social Responsibility of Business is to make money or create profits or whatever it was. Okay, so on that alternative model, the so-called dominant model, businesses are to be managed solely for the benefit of shareholders. Okay, so on the one hand, we have Freeman and the stakeholder model. On the other hand, we have Friedman and the dominant model. Okay, simple ideas create complex questions, and we proceed as follows. In the next section, we examine why the dominant story or model of business that is deeply embedded in our culture is no longer workable. It is resistant to change, not consistent with the law, and for the most part simply ignores matters of ethics. Each of these flaws is fatal in the business world of the 21st century. Okay, so let's just look at the outline of the article. So the dominant story in this column and here, Freeman is just describing the dominant model, how it came to be. Then he's going to explain that it's resistant to change. So that's going to be here and here. Then it is not consistent with the law. So that's going to be here on page 58, this first column, the second column, and this first column on 59. And it simply ignores matters of ethics. So that's going to be the second column on 59, all of 60, and then just this little bit here, the top of 61. Okay, then the second half of the article, starting here on page 61, is going to be about actually managing for stakeholders. And on page 61, you see we have this diagram that gives us all of the stakeholders. So the firm is at the center, and then these primary stakeholders are in the inner circle: communities, customers, employees, suppliers, and financiers, primarily shareholders. And then in this outer circle, we have secondary stakeholders, which we'll talk about less, but they're there as well. We'll primarily talk about these ones in the inner circle, though. Okay, so then 62, Freeman lays out the case why executives should manage for these stakeholders. Here also, let's see, 64, what executives should do and how to do it. Then some arguments for managing for stakeholders. So the argument from consequences, that's going to be an argument based on utilitarianism, which you're familiar with. The argument from rights, so you know about rights. The argument from character, that's going to be based on virtue ethics, which you know about. And then finally, based on pragmatism, that's a theory in philosophy we haven't talked about, but there's just a little bit on that at the end. Yeah, okay, so it ends there, no concluding section. Okay, we then proceed to define the basic ideas of managing for stakeholders and why it solves some of the problems of the dominant model. In particular, we pay attention to how using stakeholder as a basic unit of analysis makes it more difficult to ignore matters of ethics. We argue that the primary responsibility of the executive is to create as much value for stakeholders as possible, and that no stakeholder interest is viable in isolation of the other stakeholders. We sketch 3 primary arguments from ethical theory for adopting managing for stakeholders. We conclude by outlining a 4th pragmatist argument that suggests we see managing for stakeholders as a new narrative about business that lets us improve the way we currently create value for each other. Capitalism is, on this view, a system of social cooperation and collaboration rather than primarily a system of competition. Okay, the dominant story, managerial capitalism with shareholders at the center. The modern business corporation has emerged during the 20th century as one of the most important innovations in human history, yet the changes that we are now experiencing call for its reinvention. Before we suggest what this revision, managing for stakeholders or stakeholder capitalism, is, first we need to understand how the dominant story came to be told. Somewhere in the past, organizations were quite simple, and doing business consisted of buying raw materials from suppliers, converting it to products, and selling it to customers. For the most part, owner-entrepreneurs founded such simple businesses and worked at the business along with members of their families. The development of the new production processes, such as the assembly line, meant that jobs could be specialized and more work could be accomplished. New technologies and sources of power became readily available. These and other social and political forces combined to require larger amounts of capital well beyond the scope of most individual owner, manager, employees. Okay, so larger amounts of capital, you can just think of that as money. So these businesses required more money than the owner, him or herself, would have on hand. Additionally, workers or non-family members began to dominate the firm and were the rule rather than the exception. Owners of the business became more dispersed as capital was raised from banks, stockholders, and other institutions. Indeed, the management of the firm became separated from the ownership of the firm. Okay, so you're familiar with that from Freeman's article. The owners of most large corporations, or even medium-sized corporations, are the shareholders, and those who run the business, the executives, Freeman primarily refers to them as managers, work for the shareholders. Indeed, the management of the firm became separated from the ownership of the firm, and in order to be successful, the top managers of the business had to simultaneously satisfy the owners, shareholders, the employees, and their unions, suppliers, and customers. This system of organization of business along the line set forth here was known as managerial capitalism or laissez-faire capitalism, or more recently, shareholder capitalism. As business grew, managers developed a means of control via the divisionalized firm, led by Alfred Sloan at General Motors. The divisionalized firm with a central headquarters staff was widely adapted. The dominant model for managerial authority was the military and civil service bureaucracy. By creating rational structures and processes, the orderly progress of business growth could be well managed. Thus, managerialism, hierarchy, and stability and predictability all evolved together in the United States and Europe to form the most powerful economic system in the history of humanity. The rise of bureaucracy and managerialism was so strong that the economist Joseph Schumpeter predicted that it would wipe out the creative forces of capitalism, stifling innovation in its drive for predictability and stability. During the last 50 years, this managerial model has put shareholders at the center of the firm as the most important group for managers to worry about. This mindset has dealt with the increasing complexity of the business world by focusing more intensely on shareholders and creating value for shareholders. It has become common wisdom to increase shareholder value, and many companies have instituted complex incentive compensation plans aimed at aligning the interests of executives with the interests of shareholders. These incentive plans are often tied to the price of a company's stock, which is affected by many factors, not the least of which is the expectations of Wall Street analysts about the earnings per share each quarter. Meeting Wall Street targets and forming a stable and predictable base of quarter-over-quarter increases in earnings per share has become the standard for measuring company performance. Indeed, all of the recent scandals at Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, and others are in part due to executives trying to increase shareholder value, sometimes in opposition to accounting rules and law. Unfortunately, the world has changed so that the stability and predictability required by the shareholder approach can no longer be assured. Okay, the dominant model is resistant to change. The managerial view of business with the shareholders at the center is inherently resistant to change. Okay, let me just note here, Freeman uses different terms, dominant model, managerial model, or managerial view, but we only have two things. One, the stakeholder model that Freeman himself is defending, and then the view defended by Friedman, where the executive's purpose is to create as much value as possible for shareholders. And so Friedman's view is the dominant model or the managerial model or the laissez-faire model. All of those terms are referring to the same thing. The managerial view of business with shareholders at the center is inherently resistant to change. It puts shareholders' interests over and above the interest of customers, suppliers, employees, and others, as if these interests must conflict with each other. It understands a business as an essentially hierarchical organization fastened together with authority to act in the shareholders' interests. Executives often speak in the language of hierarchy as working for shareholders. Shareholders are the boss, and you have to do what the shareholders want. On this interpretation, change should occur only when the shareholders are unhappy, and as long as executives can produce a series of incrementally better financial results, there is no problem. According to this view, the only change that counts is change oriented towards shareholder value. If customers are unhappy, if accounting rules have been compromised, if product quality is bad, if environmental disaster looms, even if competitive forces threaten, the only interesting questions are whether and how these forces for change affect shareholder value, measured by the price of the stock every day. Okay, so one thing to point out here, all of these things that Freeman lists, customers are unhappy, product quality is bad, environmental disaster looms, even if competitive forces threaten. The only interesting question is whether and how these forces affect shareholder value. Okay, so everything I just repeated there, Friedman would agree with, but he did say, you might recall on the first page of his article, that executives should try to make as much money for shareholders as they can while following the law. So Friedman, anyway, wouldn't endorse accounting rules being compromised. Okay, unfortunately, in today's world, there is just too much uncertainty and complexity to rely on such a single criterion. Business in the 21st century is global and multifaceted, and shareholder value may not capture that dynamism. Or if it does, as the theory suggests, it must eventually. It will be too late for executives to do anything about it. The dominant story may work for how things turn out in the long run on Wall Street, but managers have to act with an eye to Main Street as well, to anticipate change, to try and take advantage of the dynamism of business. Okay, the dominant model is not consistent with the law. In actual fact, the clarity of putting shareholders' interests first, above that of customers, suppliers, employees, and communities, flies in the face of the reality of law. The law has evolved to put constraints on the kinds of trade-offs that can be made. In fact, the law of corporations gives a clear answer to the question of in whose interest and for whose benefit the corporation should be governed. The law has evolved over the years to give de facto standing to the claims of groups other than stockholders. It has, in effect, required that the claims of customers, suppliers, local communities, and employees be taken into consideration. For instance, the doctrine of privity of contract as articulated in Winterbottom v. Wright in 1842. So in that case, the consequence was, or the ruling was, that only those who sign a contract are subject to its terms. Okay, so that ruling has been eroded by recent developments in product liability law. Freeman v. Yuba Power gives the manufacturer strict liability for damage caused by its products, even though the seller has exercised all possible care in the preparation and sale of the product, and the customer has not bought the product from nor entered into any contract or contractual arrangement with the manufacturer. Okay, so the idea here would be the manufacturer makes something, some other middle person sells it to the customer, so there's no actual interaction between the customer and the manufacturer, but still the manufacturer is responsible for that product, even if they made it with the best intentions. The caveat emptor has been replaced in large part with caveat venditor. Okay, so that's buyer beware has been replaced with seller beware. The Consumer Product Safety Commission has the power to enact product recalls, essentially leading to an increase in the number of voluntary product recalls by companies seeking to mitigate legal damage awards. Some industries are required to provide information to customers about a product's ingredients, whether or not the customers want and are willing to pay for this information. Thus, companies must take the interests of customers into account by law. A similar story can be told about the evolution of the law forcing management to take the interests of employees into account. The National Labor Relations Act gave employees the right to unionize and to bargain in good faith. It set up the National Labor Relations Board to enforce these rights with management. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 constrain management from discrimination in hiring practices. These have been followed with the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967 and recent extensions affecting people with disabilities. The emergence of a body of administrative case law arising from labor management disputes and the historic settling of discrimination claims with large employers have caused the emergence of a body of management practice that is consistent with the legal guarantee of the rights of employees. Okay, so the point of the previous paragraph was that companies must take the interests of customers into account by law, and so the point of this paragraph is that companies must take the interests of employees into account by law, at least to an extent. The law has also evolved to try and protect the interests of local communities. The Clean Water Act of 1977 and the Clean Air Act of 1990 and various amendments to these classic pieces of legislation have constrained management from spoiling the commons. In a historic case, Marsh v. Alabama, the Supreme Court ruled that a company-owned town was subject to the provisions of the U.S. Constitution, thereby guaranteeing the rights of local citizens and negating the property rights of the firm. Current issues center around protecting local businesses, forcing companies to pay the healthcare costs of their employees, increases in minimum wage, environmental standards, and the effects of business development on the lives of local community members. These issues fill the local political landscapes, and executives and their companies must take account of them. Some may argue that the constraints of the law, at least in the U.S., have become increasingly irrelevant in a world where business is global in nature. However, globalization simply makes this argument stronger. The laws that are relevant to business have evolved differently around the world, but they have evolved nonetheless to take into account the interests of groups other than just shareholders. For example, each state in India has a different set of regulations that affect how a company can do business. In China, the law has evolved to give business some property rights, but it is far from exclusive. And in most of the European Union, laws around civil society and the role of employees are much more complex than even U.S. law. Laissez-faire capitalism is simply a myth. The idea that business is about maximizing value for stockholders regardless of the consequences to others is one that has outlived its usefulness. The dominant model simply does not describe how business operates. Another way to see this is that if executives always have to qualify maximize shareholder value with exceptions of law or even good practice, then the dominant story isn't very useful anymore. There are just too many exceptions. Okay, so everything we just went over in this section, we have 5 paragraphs, and then this part here that I underlined in red. So let me just show you here. So this is an outline of that section. So the first paragraph was making this point. The law has changed so that firms do have responsibilities to the stakeholders, customers, suppliers, local communities, and employees. Then in the second paragraph, the point was product liability laws protect customers from harm even when the harm is wholly unintentional. In the third paragraph, the point was employees are protected by laws about unionizing and preventing some discrimination, and case law also protects some rights of employees. The fourth paragraph was about local communities. There are laws protecting local communities from some harms that might be done by companies. You can see the text for what those are. And then the fifth paragraph was about the global picture. So globally, there are different laws, but there are laws protecting the rights of these stakeholders around the world. Okay, so given these 5 points, the conclusion that the author draws, the conclusion that Freeman draws, is this. The traditional view, i.e. only focus on the interest of shareholders, isn't the case anymore. Okay, so that's an outline of what was going on in that section, but also just to reinforce the point, the idea is that 1 through 5 support the author's conclusion. So 1 through 5 is the evidence or the reasons, or sometimes we say the premises for this conclusion. Okay, and then one other thing I want to show you before I go back to the article. So these two terms, normative and descriptive. So a normative sentence or claim expresses what ought to be the case. A descriptive sentence or claim expresses what is the case. Okay, so for instance, let's say that Joe killed Bill. So the sentence, Joe killed Bill, is a descriptive sentence. It just expresses what happened. Now we might also say Joe shouldn't have or Joe ought not to have killed Bill. So that would be a normative sentence. So a sentence that expresses what ought to be or what ought not to be or what should not be the case is a normative sentence or a normative claim. Okay, so these 1 through 5 are all descriptive claims or descriptive sentences. And then it's drawing this conclusion. However, okay, so the dominant model simply does not describe how business operates. But then Freeman says the dominant model could be saved by arguing that it describes a normative view about how business should operate despite how actual businesses have evolved. So this argument that we were just looking at in this section gives us this conclusion that the dominant model doesn't describe how businesses operate. That's a descriptive claim, but the dominant model could be saying that that's the way that executives should be managing their companies. Okay, so we need to look more closely at some of the conceptual and normative problems that the dominant model raises.